This week we look at punk, pop, and postmodern design, the colorful design trends of the 1980s. As the social unrest of the 1960s and 70s faded in the rearview mirror, and conservative politicians in the US and the UK rose to power, the Cold War officially ended as the Berlin Wall crumbled, new computer technologies were born, and new musical genres emerged from recording studios and art schools. The first of these we'll take a look at is punk rock, born in the USA and quickly taking off in Britain. This is The Clash, with the same spirit of rebellion against increasingly conservative cultures. Before we talk about the music, we'll talk about this street art phenomena called zines. Zines were self-printed underground magazines made using the budding technology of cheap copy machines and a DIY aesthetic. One of the main artists in the UK experimenting with zines was Jamie Reed. This is his work, Say It With Bricks, from the Suburban Press, which was his zine. Zines mostly focused on the world of music, art, and self-expression. Jamie Reed's gritty publication, Suburban Press, addressed issues like corporate corruption, government control, the banking system, and the loss of individual power to institutions. He created this sticker collection for Suburban Press as an insert. It was in these hit-and-run days from 1971 to 1975 that Jamie Reed learned his craft: move fast, keep it cheap, and see what hits home. Many of the visual ideas we know and love from the 80s rock scene were worked out during this pre-punk period. Along with Jamie Reed, these two, Malcolm McLaren and Vivienne Westwood, are going to crop up again and again in this presentation. They codified the fashion conventions of the punk era: torn vintage t-shirts, dog collars, Sparks, and Titan plaid, and managed bands. McLaren managed the bands and Westwood designed the clothes, and the two of them operated a shop, gallery, and performance space in London. McLaren eventually moved to New York and began to manage the Ramones. This work by Jamie Reed, he repurposed from an insert in his Suburban Press and made into the poster and the album cover for a single by the Sex Pistols called Pretty Vacant. I love the buses to nowhere and to boredom. Jamie Reed met Malcolm McLaren at art school in Croydon, which is a suburb of London, and when McLaren formed the Sex Pistols, Jamie's aesthetic took over their posters, flyers, and album covers. One of the most famous was the God Save the Queen album, designed in 1977, in the year of the Queen's Silver Jubilee, making it a topical and controversial piece. Just the fact of covering the Queen's face with cutout type was very radical. He produced an alternate and even more controversial cover with the Queen's mouth pierced with a safety pin and her eyes covered with swastikas. This cover for the next Sex Pistols album was just as shocking, but it kind of loses its power if you're not familiar with the British slang meaning of the bollocks. Supposedly that was a quote from Malcolm McLaren. Meanwhile, in Queens, New York, a Hungarian immigrant named Thomas Erdley, Tommy, the son of a hard-drinking construction worker, John Cummings, also known as Johnny, the bassist Doug Colvin, Dee Dee, and singer Jeffrey Hyman, Joey, formed a high school rock band. They adopted the last name Ramone and posed as brothers. Ramone was a pseudonym sometimes used by Paul McCartney when he wanted to check into a hotel unknown. This photograph is from their first album. They were photographed by Punk Magazine's Roberta Bailey, who received only $125 for the shot, and it's one of the most imitated rock music covers ever. Today we think of, the quintessence of rock music as a leather jacket, ripped jeans, and graffiti, and there it was all together for the first time. Their music and visual aesthetic were inspired by comic books, horror films, girl groups, and garage rock. influenced their songwriting, and the design of their posters was as stripped down as their 2-minute songs. This iconic photograph by Penny Smith is of bassist from The Clash in concert, smashing his guitar on stage, one of the most iconic images in rock, and it was used on the cover of The Clash's album London Calling. And in keeping with that punk repurposing kind of DIY aesthetic, they stole the layout from an Elvis album. So instead of a British queen, in this case, they're parodying an image of an American king. This image, the image of the smashing guitar, represents the turning point in the history of rock and roll, a total loss of control, according to one critic. And even years later, that image was repurposed by the street artist Banksy. Meanwhile, 3 art students from the Rhode Island School of Design moved to New York and formed a different genre of punk band, the Talking Heads. This appropriately arty mosaic is made of Polaroid close-ups to form the cover of their second album. Polaroids, like copy machines and Sony Walkman, were bridge technologies that were soon to be made extinct by the burgeoning digital world. The artwork for this cover, Remain in Light, is an early experiment in digital imaging that was conceived by the bassist Tina Weymouth and the drummer Chris Franz, and crafted with the help of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Computer Lab and the designer Tibor Kalman from M & Company. And the title Remain in Light is a play on the visual, which is, the warning sign when an image is overexposed in digital medium. You can see the pixelization of the images there. On the back of the cover, it pays homage to the era of punk rock by creating an image created with both trained and untrained designers in the aid of early computers and copy machines, a mix of appropriation and anti-propaganda. Another experiment in early digital art is this famous cover for the band Joy Division. The image depicts radio waves that were emitted from a collapsed star, a pulsar, as captured by a plotting machine. The designer Peter Saville found the original image in the Cambridge Encyclopedia of Astronomy and reversed the colors to make a black background with white line art. And in a radical move for the time, on the album cover, all the text was absent, leaving an enigmatic image floating in black space, the image of a dead star. In a later cover for Joy Division, Peter Saville refers to art from the Italian futurist Fortunato de Pero, his poster for the 1932 exposition Futurismo Trentino. Saville says he referenced the work with a degree of irony for music created on the cusp of a post-industrial world in 1980, and he imagined that Fortunato de Pero would have approved. As we'll talk about later, the spirit of irony and the reference to past design movements and appropriation and remix are all essential ingredients in postmodernism, as well as punk. But first, let's examine the artistic roots of another major musical genre, hip-hop. While punk rock was born in working-class white neighborhoods of the 1970s, youth of color were creating their own new art forms in the shape of rap, DJing, breakdancing, or b-boying, and graffiti writing. By the very early 1980s, Bronx DJ and founding visionary Afrika Bambaataa declared that these sometimes disparate scenes comprised a single culture, which he called hip-hop. The movie Wild Style is considered the first hip-hop movie from 1982. The scene was in full bloom by then, but the movie featured a cast including Fab Five Freddy, Lady Pink, the Rocksteady Crew, Queen Lisa Lee, and Grandmaster Flash. Lee George Quinones was an innovative graffiti master in the Bronx. He played the protagonist in the movie Wild Style. This is him as a young man. And he was at first known for his full car tags on subway trains. Graffiti artists in the 70s evolved from competitive, straightforward tagging of the artist's name to larger and more elaborate works. The game was won if you could cover an entire train, 10 cars from top to bottom, with artwork, which was difficult, if not impossible, to do. But even as it became a true art form, the danger of doing something illegal remained part of the appeal, and artists worked in the subways and subway tunnels and streets of New York, battling against anti-graffiti crews. Lady Pink, one of the most accomplished female graffiti artist of all time, says, "Our generation of graffiti writers of the early 80s specifically went for the subway trains." Now a respected fine artist, teacher, and historian, Pink said, "We need rebellion in our society. We need someone to question the status quo." This is one of her tags from 1983. Many artists like Fab Five Freddy crossed disciplinary boundaries, doing art, writing, performing, and producing music. When Russell Simmons partnered with producer Rick Rubin to form Def Jam Records, a new standard was set for musicians to control their own musical property and the resulting income. And the pair collaborated with C. Adams, who was another graffiti artist, to create the iconic Def Jam logo here seen on the Beastie Boys album Rock Hard from 1984. Say Adams was a graffiti artist who defined the visual look of Def Jam Records at its formation and became its creative director. He emerged from the downtown graffiti movement to exhibit alongside fellow artist Jean-Michel Basquiat and Keith Haring. Here is his iconic Beastie Boys logo. You can see it in position on a wall and as a logo. Adams created visual identities, album covers, logos, and campaigns for bands like Run DMC, the Beastie Boys, LL Cool J, Public Enemy, the Notorious B.I.G., Maroon 5, and Jay-Z. He's still working today and focusing on themes including pop culture, brand identity, cultural and community issues. He's collaborated with a lot of big brands like Levi's, Converse, Pabst, YouTube, and Google, and shows his own work in galleries. Chuck D of Public Enemy also straddled visual and musical art. His silhouette of a b-boy in the crosshairs of a rifle sight reflects his belief that every young black man was a target of the police. In 1990, he did a napkin sketch of a black planet eclipsing planet Earth. B.E. Johnson, a famous NASA artist, was hired to render the concept, and although he was sure that Chuck's vision was astrophysically impossible, he painted it anyway. Not only is it one of the greatest album covers of all time, it turned out to be one of the most popular pieces that the artist B.E. Johnson has ever done. In 1986, the group De La Soul collaborated with a radical British art collective known as the Grey Organization on this album cover. While it might seem like an unlikely collaboration, the artists Mott and Spencer were famous in London for their direct action paint attacks on Cork Street art galleries. Here you can see an English policeman cleaning up a tossed gray paint on the front of an art gallery. The Grey Organization had recently moved from London to New York to begin work as bicycle messengers, and they met the band De La Soul. It's again showing this cohesive spirit of rebellion that united movements of British punk and American rap and hip-hop. This is an identity card created by Toby Mott from the Grey Organization. Meanwhile, the photographer Martha Cooper was prowling the subway tracks at night in New York to capture the fleeting art of the streets as the Metropolitan Transit Authority battled artists with an anti-graffiti police patrol, new kinds of paint and subway tiles in the stations that were easier to clean, and a determination to eliminate what was seen as vandalism that conflicted with the gentrification of neighborhoods in the outer boroughs. Of course, two important visual artists that arose from the graffiti writing scene are Jean-Michel Basquiat and Keith Haring. Haring, of course, from Kutztown, Pennsylvania, was a prolific graffiti artist that began doing unauthorized street works and then moved into galleries and major murals, and all kinds of commercial ventures, including opening his own store, The Pop Shop. Both artists used repeated symbols and combined drawing and writing, including short sayings that were almost like taglines. One critic said they had the same effect as advertising. The greatest thing is to come up with something so good it seems as if it's always been there, like a proverb. Meanwhile, West Coast hip-hop was developing too. This iconic album, from the point of view of someone on the ground, apparently about to be shot, was a result of the photographer Eric Poppleton, who followed the members of NWA around alleys in Los Angeles for this photo shoot. This was long before the members of NWA became household names: Eric Eazy-E Wright, Andre Dr. Dre Young, O'Shea Ice Cube Jackson, Lorenzo MC Ren Patterson, and Antoine DJ Yella Caraby. "We were just trying stuff. It wasn't lit. It was raw, just like those guys," he says. "Photographically, I just laid on the ground and looked up, and all the guys stood over me with a gun. We were making stuff up. It wasn't a big deal to us at the time." This logo for the Wu-Tang Clan, another iconic hip-hop logo, was done by Ronald Bean, aka Mathematics, another rapper, who says the logo was done in one night based on a sticker he did of a graffiti W. Some people think that it looks like the Batman symbol, but it's meant to be a W. Individual band members have done their own take on the logo. The bottom right is Method Man flipping it 100 degrees to form an M, and on the top right, the GZA rotating at 90 degrees clockwise to form a G. The yellow piece is a custom-cut yellow vinyl container for a record. Much later, in 2014, the rapper RZA is shown here with the sole copy of the group's album Once Upon a Time in Shaolin. It was their 7th studio album that was recorded in secret over 6 years, and a single 2-copy CD was pressed in 2014. It was stored in a secured vault at the Royal Mansour Hotel in Marrakesh, Morocco, and then auctioned off for the reported price of $2 million, the most expensive work of music ever sold. This is the silver and jewel-encrusted album box containing the 2 CDs, sealed with a wax Wu-Tang Clan seal and containing leather-bound liner notes. Just a great image that shows the distance that hip-hop traveled from the streets of LA to a silver box locked in a hotel in Marrakesh. Meanwhile, a more mainstream pop-punk band, Blondie, worked in a more commercial vein but appropriated hip-hop culture in the 1980 hit Rapture, with a shout-out to Fab Five Freddy and featuring Lee Quinones and Jean-Michel Basquiat doing graffiti in the background of the music video. Another art form was evolving in Harlem in the 1970s, late 70s and early 80s, along with hip-hop, the unique dance form of voguing. This is Willie Ninja, who is a dancer and choreographer and also the mother of the House of Ninja. He was a breakout star. Voguing was born from drag pageants and the formation of competitive teams or houses that formed around central mothers and fathers. The houses took the place of families for gay kids of color who often were disowned by their real families and lived pretty precarious existences on the streets and piers of New York City during the late 70s and 80s. And voguing was a style of dancing that was born out of the drag pageants and the formation of these competitive dance teams with signature frozen moves. The style was appropriated by Malcolm McLaren. It pops up again in the video Waltz Darling, who hired Willie Ninja, who was one of the dancers, who was also then hired by Madonna, along with some other backup dancers in her hit video Vogue. Meanwhile, back in the mainstream of design, if Madonna wasn't mainstream enough, we have a movement that evolved out of the modern movement. I feel like I've worn out the word modern, but just as a rewind, when it comes to design, the word is mostly associated with the movements that began as part of the Bauhaus. Modernist architects in the 1920s rejected ornament and embraced minimalism and a radical departure from previous styles. And in graphic designers, we evolved to the International Typographic style in Switzerland, and then to the lively American modernists like Paul Rand and Alvin Lustig. Last week, we looked at work that departed radically from the so-called objectivity and order of the Swiss modern style into everything handmade, organic, collaborative, messy, and personal. Instead of trying to look new, artists turned towards decorative styles from the past like Art Nouveau and the Vienna Secession, referencing all kinds of movements from the history of graphic design. And as a historical and social context, again, in the 1960s, design centered on social activism. In the 1970s, it became more self-absorbed and personal. And then in the 1980s, the social, economic, and environmental awareness of the period caused many to believe that modernism was no longer relevant in a post-industrial society. Culturally, architects, economists, feminists, and even theologians embraced the term postmodernism to express a climate of cultural change. And perhaps, again, vague and overused, postmodernism became a byword in the last quarter of the 20th century. Some people use the terms late modernism or mannerism as alternative descriptors for the style. Of course, the prefix Post means after modernism. There were postmodern movements in architecture and literature as well as design. Whatever modernism declared itself to be, postmodern tried to be the opposite. So where modernism was objective and neutral, trying to remove the emotion of the designer, postmodernism included humor, irony, and self-referential personality. If modern design was gridded, orderly, and sans serif, postmodern design was spontaneous and eccentric, departing from the grid. Whatever modernists hated, postmodernists drew from. Modernists wanted to abolish all association with the past. Postmodernists loved historical reference. Modernists wanted to strip away all decorative details. Postmodernists doubled down on decoration. Modernism was international and tried to remove considerations of location and time period, where postmodernist was specific to place, time, and purpose. With postmodernism, the idea became more important than the building in architecture. This is a famous design by the architect Robert Venturi that was never even built. It was a competition model for the Football Hall of Fame in 1967 with a giant projection screen of a football field on the side of the building. Here, information replaces structure as the dominant subject of the architectural form. A popular idea of postmodernism was deconstruction, the taking apart of things, rather than construction. So deconstruction or wreckage is shown here in this showroom by the designer James Wines for Best Products in Houston, Texas. It was designed to look like the building was being demolished, which is even more ironic given that the items sewn within are like home goods. As the intellectual ideas of postmodernism spread beyond architecture, they began to affect product, interior, and graphic design. And for a while, it seemed like every architect had to design a teapot. Postmodernists liked to play with humor, visual tricks, drama, and color. A perfect example of the use of postmodernism in both architecture and design is the Robert Venturi Princeton University campus buildings, with surface ornamentation as a key ingredient in their design. 5 major directions of postmodern graphic design include early branches off the Swiss style, new wave typography, and a 1980s era work from the Memphis Group, retro and revivals of earlier designs, and the electronic revolution of the late 1980s. Supergraphics use concrete graphic forms with architecture. Supergraphics are designs incorporating bold geometric shapes, bright color, huge pictographs that twist and extend beyond and around corners, and oftentimes giant Helvetica letter forms. This application of graphic form brought vitality and color to the built environment. Both the name and the idea of supergraphics caught public attention, and by 1980, they were used in corporate identification systems, interior designs for shops, and to brighten schools and factory environments. One of the first graphic designers to use supergraphics in combination with an architectural plan was Barbara Stofucker-Solomon. Her supergraphics for the condominium development Sea Ranch in California in 1966 were done in collaboration with the architect Charles W. Moore, and she brought vitality and order through supergraphics to this condo project. The design is a strong counterpoint to the architectural structure. Vibrant primary colors, sans serif letters, arcs, and slashing diagonals bring energy and activation to the space. And Barbara Solomon was a graphic design student from the Basel School of Design. Could not be more Swiss than that. Here's another close-up. Sometimes it's hard to read in these images what are pieces of architecture and what are pieces of typography, but this is a view from a stairwell. Along with postmodernism was the movement of new wave typography. In 1970s, designers and teachers schooled in the Swiss style again wanted to reinvent typographic design, similar to what Herbert Bayer, Jan Tischold, and others did in the 1920s, and this reinvention of type was called new wave photography. The design conventions that were adopted as new wave included sans serif type, spaced out, ruled lines that energize the space, type on a diagonal, font changes within a single word, type reversed out of a bar, and bold stair-stepped rules. All of those conventions of new wave design are shown here in new wave music covers, album covers of the 70s and 80s. new wave music featured pop and electro synthesizer. And speaking of new wave, here was Professor Lemon in 1984 as a senior in college. You could not be more new wave than that. Flock of Seagulls haircut and a hand-cropped, hand-screen-printed 1984 t-shirt. Here's another example of a new wave type, a poster for exhibition of classical music in 1988, showing that this style was applied to everything, appropriate or not. Little background on Wolfgang Weingart. He came from Germany to Switzerland and studied type with M.L. Reuter at the Basel School of Design, then joined the faculty there with Armin Hoffman. He liked to work with lead and wood type on the letterpress, and he infused a great deal of feeling, humor, and emotion in his work and encouraged his students to do the same. He was known for questioning everything and breaking all the rules. Okay, here's some of Wolfgang Weingart's letterpress type experiments done by hand. In the mid-70s, Weingart turned his attention away from purely typographic design towards offset lithographic printing, photographic processes, and film, and experimented with collage. This is an example of this period. This is an announcement from the typographic Mannsblatter magazine in 1974, an early layered collage with overlapping images and complex dropouts, using numbers and arrows rather than left to right and top to bottom sequencing to direct the reader through the page. Very complex page. It almost looks like it was done, again, on a computer, but it was done by hand, cutting and pasting and using photographic film. Moving forward into 1982, another design by Weingart featuring modulated patterns of overlapping shapes and colors. This time the collage is more painterly. You can see an implied shape of the Matterhorn in the background that implies the shape of Switzerland. And this is a poster about posters. Dan Friedman was a designer who studied at the Ulm Institute and at the Basel School of Design, both in Switzerland, and began to play with letter forms, again, playing with all those design conventions of the new wave. This is his cover for the same magazine, Swiss Type magazine, rethinking the nature of typographic forms and thinking about how they could operate as three-dimensional forms in space. He called this piece a visual manifesto for a more inclusive typography. Friedman came back to the United States and taught courses at Yale and the Philadelphia College of Art in the early 70s. He liked to introduce his students to the basics of new typography with an exercise using the text of a daily weather report, as shown here, urged students to make their work both functional and aesthetically unconventional. They explored contrast in type, including legible and unlegible, simple and complex, orderly and disorderly, and he had a widespread influence on the teaching of typography in the United States. Here's another example of some of his exercises and a poster, a range of packaging that he designed with the design firm Ansbach Grossman, Portugal, in 1977 for the shopping store Bonwit Teller. As his own work progressed, he rejected the term postmodernism in favor of the term radical modernism. April Greiman, also a student in Switzerland, came back to the United States with new wave sensibility. This is an ad for the restaurant The China Club, which was not only a restaurant, but also a happening nightclub scene full of probably all of those characters from punk, pop, and hip-hop. One of her most famous pieces is this long 6-foot poster for Cal Arts done in 1979. By the early 1990s, we have a new movement in postmodernism called the Memphis School, inspired by a 1981 exhibition of the Italian design group Memphis that was led by the postmodernist architect Michael Graves and the architectural and product designer Ettore Satsas. A famous set of bookshelves by the Memphis Design Group here introduce some of the signifiers of the Memphis style, pattern, diagonals, and bright colors. His teapot had that little bird on the top of it. Here's a couple other works by Michael Graves at the top, the Humana Tower in Louisville, Kentucky, and on the bottom, the Esprit store in Cologne, Germany. with his signature cowl pattern on the surface. Christoph Radl and Valentina Grego worked for the group and did these early Memphis group logo designs in the early 1980s. The Memphis School movement was characterized by exaggerated geometric forms, use of surface pattern, texture, and bold color, and references to earlier cultures like Egypt and South America. Here you can see the letters retain legibility while being transformed into geometric forms with pattern and texture. At the same time as the Memphis School on the west coast of the USA, we have the San Francisco School, another creative center of postmodern design. You can spot the San Francisco designers from their gestures, shapes, color palettes, spatial arrangements, and there are a few of them called the Michaels: Michael Vanderbilt, Michael Manwaring, and Michael Cronin. They have similar styles. Here's a work by Michael Vanderbilt for the California version of NPR in 1979, Radio Pública de California. Typical postmodern shape conventions signifying the auditory and non-visual medium of radio. Another piece by Michael Vanderbilt, a classic work of postmodernism. You see a postmodern piece of architecture sticking out its tongue at a modern piece of architecture. This is from 1984. Another typical hand-drawn gestural marks over the top of a photograph on a business furniture catalog from 1985. This is a different Michael Manwaring, retail display poster with some conventions, again borrowed from punk rock, torn paper, stamps, and diagonal lines. And a collaboration between Michael Cronin and Shannon Terry for Beethoven Festival. We have some of those 80s shapes, colors, and rules. In the UK, the designer Neville Brody designed a lot of graphics and album covers for rock and roll music and art directed a couple influential magazines, including Arena and The Face, as well as designing a series of geometric sans serif typefaces and logo designs. He emerged as one of the more original graphic designers of the 1980s, combining an intuitive and logical approach. And I think that you can see a little bit of remnants of the sort of a punk rock attitude in his work, combined with some conventions from Swiss modernism. There's a book of his collected work. This is a record album cover for the band Parliament's greatest hits, The Bomb. You can see the inspiration of the geometric forms of the Russian constructivist, Dada experimental attitudes, and then hand-lettered words. He also straddled the time period between analog and digital art, so many of these are handmade, hand-lettered typography, done with a ruling pen as opposed to done on the computer. For the magazine The Face, he evolved the word contents from the contents page, deconstructing it from a readable word into abstract marks over the course of several different issues of the magazine. Here's some of the iconic magazine and album covers done by Neville Brody during the 80s. This is a Nike print ad he was commissioned to do. You can see this jazzy new typography style. Other marks of the postmodern movement in graphic design is a spirit of remixing. This is again the same time period as the invention of hip-hop, punk, and electronic music, and using those tools of sampling various pieces of artwork from different genres and time periods and mixing them together. This spirit allowed designers to incorporate multiple references into their work and had an atmosphere of expanding possibilities and experimentalism. Also, at this time, designers experimented with retro styles and vernacular styles. Retro meaning styles of a particular time, and vernacular meaning styles of a particular place or a purpose. In retro movement, designers used inspiration from a wide variety of sources: old matchbook covers, newspaper ads, graphics from the 30s and 40s, traditional typefaces, 19th century woodcuts, and decorative labels, as well as ephemera from prior years. This style first emerged in New York in the 1980s and spread around the world, especially with three artists, Paula Cher, Louise Healy, and Karen Goldberg. It was a whole movement based on historical revival. Along with, hand in hand with retro, is the movement of vernacular design, referring to artistic or technical expression characteristic of a particular location, where speaking, the word vernacular technically means speaking in the language of the locals. This is Paula Cher, one of the most famous women in design in the world, now a partner at Pentagram. She was married for a while to Seymour Quast of Pushpin fame, although he's a generation older than her. One of her most famous works is this poster for Swatch watches done in 1985. And you can see here she's repurposed the famous Herbert Matter poster from Swiss tourism poster from the 1930s or 20s. This is a spread from a promotional booklet for her firm, Koppel and Cher. You can see it again paraphrasing Russian constructivist and futurist ideas. This is now a more evolved version of her particular unique style, again joining contradictory sources of inspiration, 19th century wood-type posters and Russian constructivism in this work for CBS Records of 1979. Showing here the source and the remix. Her typographic ideas were evolved to be a highly personal style. This shows a reference and remix to a poster in 1985. Louise Feely, another female designer working in the 80s, did a bunch of book jackets, and she found a lot of inspiration in the vernacular graphics of France and Italy. She collects pieces of graphic design during her summer vacations in Europe and has published several different books about the design of different European countries, takes pictures of signs and collects vernacular graphics, finding long-lost typefaces in flea markets and used book styles. Here's some of her famous restaurant logo identity designs, again borrowing from those vernacular places and times, evoking mood, place, time, and flavor. And Karen Goldberg, a book design for the cover of the Sonnets of Orpheus in 1987, reviving some historical styles from Art Deco and the Vienna workshops. Another retro design by Daniel Pelevin and Judith Loser, finding inspiration in Gustav Klimt and the Vienna workshops. And another last piece by Daniel Pelevin, a book cover for the Hoover's Guide to the Southern California Companies, showing that Art Deco inspiration. And that's it as we say goodbye to the 80s and hello to the digital world to come.